what is it you haven't yet done that you would like to do? And what I hadn't done was write a memoir. In the response to the sudden death of my niece, I was learning about human genetics, and I was trying to protect my family from sudden death. Maybe we can put up a picture of this beautiful young woman, 36, 6 months pregnant with her first child. That's the picture, is her out to dinner with her husband the night before her sudden death. And then the next day, they just, went out in the neighborhood, stopped in a restaurant for a little snack. And as she was leaving, they gave them a card to check off, how good it was. And she said, oh, this place was a 10. And then she slumped over. She slipped down to the floor. Ambulance was there in minutes. Literally, they was downtown Brooklyn. But they were unable to start her heart. The New York City coroner was smart enough to do two things. One, she preserved Karen's tissue without formaldehyde so that years later we could do genetic studies. The DNA was not destroyed. And the other thing that she did was take out Karen's heart and send it to another medical facility where they could examine the heart. And 2 weeks later, the answer came back that they said that Karen died of dilated cardiomyopathy. Well, we now know that 50% of people who have cardiomyopathy have a mutation that caused it, but we didn't know that then. And as a matter of fact, unfortunately, a lot of doctors still don't know that.
This is Genetics for Healthcare, a podcast for patients.
Welcome, guys, to another episode of Genetics for Healthcare. This is a podcast dedicated for patients and their caregivers, their family members, their loved ones, to help them advocate for a precision medicine approach to their healthcare, which includes disease screening, treatment, and survivorship. You can catch us at geneticsforhealthcare.com. There you can track to any of our social media platforms. We'd appreciate a follow on LinkedIn, YouTube, my goodness, all the other stuff that I can't think of right now, Facebook, and even TikTok, to get notifications on new and exciting episodes like this one. Today, it is an honor to have Susan Liebman, research geneticist and author of The Dressmaker's Mirror, Sudden Death Genetics and a Jewish Family's Secret. Susan, thank you so much for being a guest on Genetics for Healthcare.
Well, thanks for inviting me. I'm excited to be here and tell my story and perhaps help make things better in the world of genetics and health.
Well, you're certainly doing that through the book and obviously your scientific efforts. And in reading your background, I got really excited to speak to you and lead in by asking you about what even attracted you to a career in healthcare, specifically genetics, because you grew up in a time and an era where women certainly, let's say, weren't welcome in STEM fields. Your abilities may have, overly doubted your abilities, or there were just opportunities that you were not going to get. What motivated you to pursue this field, and how did your experiences shape your career today?
Well, it's true that there weren't very many women in those fields, but I'm not sure it's true that at that time it was a barrier. At least I didn't feel it. My parents told me I could do anything. I could be anybody, do whatever I want. And they said it over and over again. And then when I applied to colleges and I had done well in school, they supported me in applying to MIT. There were only 50 women out of 90 students, but I was accepted and they wanted those women to succeed. There were, some people that were difficult. There were comments, yes, but the majority of the people wanted the women to succeed. And many of us did. My first interest in genetics, I think, happened when my parents sent me to a summer program for high school students at Cornell. And I took a course in microbiology, but I remember learning about DNA for the first time. And it was very exciting. So although I started college as a mathematician in math, I soon changed my major to biology. And then the different places I went and professors I met, basically I ended up in the University of Rochester after a master's at Harvard because of my husband, who had a job at Xerox. And there was a wonderful professor there, Fred Sherman, who was a famous yeast geneticist. And so I decided to learn about that. And that's what really set my career.
So what was going on in the world of genetics at the time when you were being mentored in yeast genetics? For those who don't know, what is that?
Okay, yeast genetics is a model system. It's a single-celled organism, so it's a lot easier to do experiments than in humans or mice. We didn't have CRISPR or anything to change the DNA in humans or mice, but in yeast, we could do all sorts of things. We could change DNA, we could move genes around, and it turns out that a lot of the genes in yeast are the same genes that are in humans. So a lot of the work that predated the genomic sequencing of humans was done first in yeast. And we established in yeast how to do it, what the methods were on a smaller genome. And then shortly thereafter, it was all taken over and done in humans. So yeast geneticists are actually respected by human geneticists these days because we opened the path.
Well, speaking of opening the path, your work in genetics really set you on a path to uncover family secrets and, shall we say, family genetic secrets at that. So the Dressmaker's Mirror, Sudden Death, Genetics, and a Jewish Family Secret. We'll have that on the episode page at geneticsforhealthcare.com and wherever you're listening there. You can find it on Amazon, of course. But tell us what inspired you to write this book.
Well, there were two things going on in my life at the time, three really, at the time I wrote it. One happened to everybody. It was pandemic. So we were stuck at home. Two, I was actually running a book club on Zoom, and we wanted a book that was not heavy, that would be fun because we were terrified we were all going to die from COVID. And I picked the book, Mrs. Polyfax. And I don't know if you've read that book. It's a book about an old lady. She was younger than me at the time, but most people would consider her an old lady who had to find something to do, and she becomes a CIA spy. So my question to the other readers was, what is it you haven't yet done that you would like to do? And what I hadn't done was write a memoir. So one thing was the challenge I gave myself to write a memoir during those years when we were home. And the second thing I was doing was, in the response to the sudden death of my niece, I was contacting all my relatives, and I was learning about human genetics, which was a burgeoning field at the time. It started, with the yeast genetics, but then it spread out to human genetics. And I was trying to protect my family from sudden death. And then eventually I married these two in a single book. So the story about my niece was that this beautiful young woman, 36, 6 months pregnant with her first child. That's the picture, is her out to dinner with her husband the night before her sudden death. And then the next day, they just, went out in the neighborhood, stopped in a restaurant for a little snack. And as she was leaving, they were still sitting there, they gave them a card to check off, how good it was. And she said, oh, this place was a 10. And then she slumped over. And, her husband said to her, Karen, are you joking? But he already knew that she wasn't. She slipped down to the floor. The ambulance was there in minutes, literally. It was downtown Brooklyn. But they were unable to start her heart. They delivered the baby with cesarean section, but he was too young, not developed. He died within a few minutes. And they did an autopsy, and they found nothing wrong. But the New York coroner was smart enough to do two things. One, she preserved Karen's tissue without formaldehyde so that years later we could do genetic studies. The DNA was not destroyed. And they're currently trying to teach other coroners how to do this to help families in the future. And the other thing that she did was take out Karen's heart and send it to another medical facility where they could examine the heart. And 2 weeks later, the answer came back that they said that Karen died of dilated cardiomyopathy. And they called it idiopathic because there was no reason that they knew of it. But we knew this was a shock for our family because my sister, Karen's mother, had been diagnosed in her late 50s, mid-50s, maybe 10 years before this, with idiopathic dilated cardiomyopathy. And her doctors said she got it from a virus. some long-term effects of a virus. Well, we now know that 50% of people who have cardiomyopathy have a mutation that caused it. But we didn't know that then. And as a matter of fact, unfortunately, a lot of doctors still don't know that. So that's one of the things we have to teach them. I didn't take a geneticist, but I was a geneticist to figure out that this is probably genetic. My sister had dilated cardiomyopathy. My niece has dilated cardiomyopathy. And so I set out to try to find the mutation. And I myself was not equipped to do that, but turns out that one of my fellow yeast geneticists who was in the Yeast Genetics Club at Chicago, his wife, Elizabeth McNally, was an expert in genetic cardiology. And she was at University of Chicago then, now she's at Northwestern. In any event, I became her patient. And she also, even though she didn't ever see my sister, she really was trying to find out for her research what the mutation was. And she sent my sister's DNA to the fledgling genetic testing available at the time at Harvard. It came back, weeks and weeks and weeks later. Nope, nothing we know about, because they only knew a few genes then. And she, year by year would send it out again and nothing. And finally, she said to me, it was about 5 years later. So my niece died in 2008, and in about 2011 or 12, she said to me, DNA sequencing doesn't cost $1 billion anymore. It was $1 billion to sequence the first human genome. Now it's only 50,000, and I have a grant. I can sequence 5 of my patients' DNAs whose genes we can't find. So get me your sister's DNA again, and we'll do it. And that's what she did.
So let's take a pause there, because I want to go back to something you just said. And just for clarity, cardiomyopathy is a disease of the heart muscle that makes it harder for the heart to pump blood. It could cause the heart walls, the muscles, to thicken, stiffen, or to stretch, and potentially, in any condition of cardiomyopathy, lead to heart failure. You mentioned, all of these events happening before we had the ability to really, sequence, whole genome to find, causative genetic factors. But you still, kind of had this drive that this is something that I want to solve. How did you end up, again, with the genetic cardiologist at Northwestern? How did you become, that person's, patient and then collaborator?
Because I talked about my problem with everyone I met, and certainly in my Yeast Genetics Club, I talked about it. And 5 people there, including her husband, said, "Oh, you should see Dr. Elizabeth McNally. That's her research, that she does this." And so rather than just talk to her about research, I became her patient. What she said was, yes, it's genetic. And no, we don't know what it is, but you should be checked. Your heart should be checked with echocardiograms every year. And so should your children's hearts, and so should your nephew's hearts.
Was that the first time you had that type of conversation with a care provider saying, hey, you guys should invest in screening and making sure you're having these conversations?
Absolutely. And when I told my husband, his response was, this was a fluke. I don't want to scare our children. They'll be too frightened to get married and have kids of their own. Let's not tell them. And so we had a long discussion, my husband and I, and we finally agreed that I could tell them anything I wanted, everything the doctor had told me, and everything about it once. I could tell them, they were in their 30s, late 20s, 30s. I could tell them that day everything. But I couldn't remind them every year, and I couldn't ask them what happened, and I couldn't nudge them. So I thought that was fair, and that's what we did. And the good news was my daughter followed up and got tested every year and discussed it with me. The bad news is, it turned out okay, but the bad news was that my son went to a doctor who didn't understand genetics. And the doctor said, is your mother sick? Does she have cardiomyopathy? Well, I wasn't sick, but I could have had the gene that caused illness. It just doesn't cause illness all the time. Maybe it have caused illness in me the next year. And the doctor says to him, well, if she's not sick, you can't have the gene, so forget it. So he never got tested because he never checked back with me. And so, 10 years later, when I called him to say, guess what? You don't have to do this anymore. I don't have the mutation. He said, do it? Do what? What was I supposed to do? He had totally forgotten.
Well, at the time, talking about your sister, now she was diagnosed with dilated cardiomyopathy years prior. What were the events that led up to your sister being diagnosed with that condition?
So that also was a lot of luck that she didn't die. She started getting sick. She was a first grade teacher, and she was sick all the time. And she couldn't catch her breath, and she kept going to her doctor, who gave her new antibiotics and told her, well, first grade teachers catch this stuff from their kids all the time. Finally, she said, oh, you have pneumonia, oh, you have bronchitis. My sister and her husband and her daughter were going along with this. Okay, I'm on the phone every week with her, and this did not sound right. This was going on for months. And she's telling me she can't even walk across the room. She can't do her dancing. She can't go to bridge. Nothing in her life was working. So I called my nephew, and I told him, he was in Boston. I said, this is going on with your mom. And he said, oh, we're going to go visit her next week. And his wife is a doctor. And so they went to visit, and her daughter-in-law watches her crossing the room, and she says, oh my God, Mom, I think you're in heart failure. Now, we didn't know what heart failure was. We thought heart failure meant your heart stopped, but heart failure, of course, means your heart's not doing very well and it's not working. She sent her to a cardiologist who found, yes, she was in heart failure, and yes, she had dilated cardiomyopathy. So all this pneumonia, bronchitis, that was all not correct. What she had was heart failure. And when you have heart failure, you can't breathe, you're coughing, and she couldn't lie down. She had to be on pillows. And there's medicines. And she was immediately put on medicines that made her better. And over the years, there were better and better medicines. So she lived for 15 years after that, and a good life. She was able to play doubles tennis with the medicines. But she had no idea. They told her it was, since she didn't smoke, well, she had smoked as a young person, but she didn't smoke anymore. She didn't have diabetes. She didn't take drugs. She wasn't alcoholic. They thought it was caused by some virus that had a long-term effect. The way we know COVID can have a long-term effect, so can other viruses.
With dilated cardiomyopathy, you mentioned it had to be good fortune, because the challenge with dilated cardiomyopathy is many times a patient doesn't get diagnosed with it. It becomes an event where, like your niece, unfortunately, they pass away, and in an autopsy, it is found there.
So I set out to do a research project. It turns out that this, when we found the mutation, I did literature searches and eventually found out that the mutation was found only in Ashkenazi Jews, not in anybody else. So I decided to do a little research project where I would find Ashkenazi Jews who had dilated cardiomyopathy and see how frequent it was caused by this one mutation, because I didn't have to sequence the whole genome. I just had to sequence, 10 base pairs. So I could do that in my little yeast lab. The problem was I couldn't find people who knew that they had dilated cardiomyopathy who were still alive, because most people have dilated cardiomyopathy, have no idea they have it until they die. Occasionally they get heart failure like my sister and get diagnosed first, but often the first sign is death.
Now, it was your sister's DNA that was donated, correct?
My sister's DNA that was first sequenced, yes.
First sequenced.
Because she was alive and we knew she had the disease. We didn't know if I had it, so it would not make sense to sequence my DNA.
And for years, when the DNA was sequenced, they weren't finding anything because we didn't have the technology, or was there anything to be found because it hadn't been quite discovered yet?
Yeah, so in the beginning, there were 2 genes that were known to cause dilated cardiomyopathy. So they just sequenced those 2 genes. She didn't have any mutation. Then there were 5 genes. Then there were 10 genes. We kept sequencing more of the known genes that caused cardiomyopathy, and she didn't have any of them. Well, there were a lot of genes that caused cardiomyopathy, but we didn't know what they were. So that was Dr. McNally's research. She said, well, now I can sequence every single gene in her genome, all 25,000 of them, not 7, all 25,000. Well, you can't analyze all 25,000, and there's lots of mutations and things that cause nothing, so it's difficult. But a researcher who knows about the heart can look at the genes that she knows are involved in the heart. And one of the genes she looked at was something that's called FLNC. It makes a muscle that's involved in your muscles, but also a heart muscle. And my sister's gene was all messed up. One of the copies of her gene was clearly not going to work. And so she hypothesized that that was the cause. She didn't tell me because she wasn't sure. She published a paper and she didn't tell me. I moved away, and it wasn't until I wrote to her after my sister's death what's happening that she spilled the beans and told me about the paper. And that's when I looked it up and found someone else had published the same mutation at the same time as her, the exact same nucleotide change. And I called, it turned out this guy's father was a yeast geneticist I knew, not the patient, the researcher, but the person who had the mutation had the same symptoms as my sister, but had checked off, don't bother me again, so they couldn't contact him. And then I found, when I spoke with the genetic counselor in Dr. McNally's office, who urged me to get my DNA sequenced through clinical sequencing. It had already been sequenced in their lab. We already knew from the paper that I didn't have the mutation, but they didn't have all the controls. They could have made a mistake. They weren't clinically certified to do proper sequencing for patients. And so I went ahead and got it sequenced through a clinical provider. And then the genetic cardiologist actually got on the phone and talked to me about it. And I asked her, is there a website where companies like this GeneDex, who sequenced my DNA, will list patients who have this mutation and what it costs? And she says, there's a brand new website, ClinGen, that does just that. So of course I got off the phone and looked up ClinGen and looked up our mutation. And there was a paper that had come out just that year, referenced there, and I contacted the author, and he had about 20 different families that had mutations in this gene that caused cardiomyopathy. But 2 of those families had my family's exact mutation to the nucleotide. Well, there's 3,000 nucleotides. How could you have the exact same? It's a little weird. And so I looked that up in the inflammatory bowel disease database. That was the best genetic database at the time. What it told you was the exact nucleotide change and whether it did or did not cause inflammatory bowel disease. Well, I'm not interested in inflammatory bowel disease. But it also told you whether the people that were sequenced were different ethnicities. And they had 5,000 Ashkenazi Jews in this, because inflammatory bowel disease is actually a lot of Ashkenazi Jews have that mutation. But they also had, a whole bunch of Europeans and Finnish. And it turned out that 1 in 800 Ashkenazi Jews had this mutation, but nobody else. So it looked like what we call a founder mutation. And it's been in my family for probably 500 years.
Speaking specifically about Ashkenazi Jewish men and women, 1 in 40 carry a BRCA mutation versus 1 in, up to 800 of the general population, according to Susan G. Corman's website. 1 in 10 women diagnosed with breast cancer at any age have a BRCA1 or 2 mutation. 1 out of 10 Ashkenazi Jewish women have a BRCA 1 or 2 mutation versus 1 in 50 women diagnosed with breast cancer in the general population or outside that ethnicity. Why has science been able to trace Ashkenazi Jewish founder mutations or identify this particular population for the prevalence of genetic variants?
Well, it's not why they've been able to trace it. It's why do we have it, is what you really mean. And the reason we have it is there's other small populations who also have this, who are isolated. But the reason the Ashkenazi Jews has it is that when they were expelled from Israel, many of them ended up in Europe and many of them ended up in Poland. And they were in ghetto groups and there was anti-Semitism and many of them were killed in the pogroms. And there was a time about 500 years ago when there were only about 500 left. So there had been thousands of Jews living there, but they were all killed, and there were 500 survivors. So out of the thousands that were living there, 1 of them had a BRCA mutation, same rate as everybody else. But it happened that woman survived, or man survived, and was one of the 500 in the end. Now they intermarried, and they continued to intermarry for centuries. And so that BRCA mutation is now 1 in 40 instead of much less, because of that survivorship. The same thing, French Canadians that are isolated, people who are there are found mutations, in other isolated groups. But that's the story with the Ashkenazi founder mutation.
And we're still finding them, obviously.
And presumably there's some good ones too. I mean, that we don't know about. But
well, going back on your sister, from the time that she was diagnosed and you were able to donate genetic material, from that time till the time that the genetic cardiologist actually thought she had zeroed in on that particular variant, what length of time was that?
So shortly after my niece died was 2008, and McNally published the sequence in 2014, and she had to have sequenced it a year or two before that.
And even then, there were still papers that, after the first, had to come out to continue to validate that information and build upon it to the point where now we can put this into panels and trace that particular and test for that particular gene.
Yes,
variant.
and there's still genes we don't know, which is why so I did want to mention maybe I'll send you this postcard. You can't see it because it's backwards, but this is the Genetic Cardiomyopathy Awareness Consortium, whose goal in life is the same as mine, to spread I want to spread the news about genetic testing in general for cancer as well as for heart disease and for all diseases. But they're focusing on cardiomyopathy. They're providing free testing now for people who have cardiomyopathy because 50% of the people who have cardiomyopathy have a genetic cause.
And that just shows how, our knowledge of genetics, our ability to interrogate the human genome has improved in leaps and bounds. Our ability to screen, to identify subgroups of patients who are affected by certain things. And that has led to new therapies, targeted therapies, and even the ability, as we talked about at the top of the show, the ability to edit genes to correct these types of aberrations.
Right now, you don't have to edit. You can just take pills to save your life and have an implanted defibrillator to save your life. Or in cancer, you can continue to get clinical screens more frequently to help save your life so you can treat it sooner. So now I recall why I wanted to show you this. They're talking about getting tested and retested because every year we have more genes. So, as we learn more, we want to do more testing.
Even then, it's standard of care for cardiomyopathy patients to receive germline genetic testing.
It is, but only 1% of them get it. 1% instead of 100% get sent for genetic testing, even though it is standard of care. So we have a lot of education to do.
What do you think besides, clinician education? Because I think they, to your point, they haven't studied genetics, right? And even the field of genetics and what we thought we knew 10 years ago has evolved tremendously now. What other barriers exist and how can we improve patient access to getting genetic testing and the right appropriate workups?
The first thing is both the doctors and the patients think it still costs $1 billion or even $50,000. It doesn't. You can get it done either for free or for $250 and insurance may cover it. It's just no more expensive than any other test that we get. That's a very hard thing to teach. I try it in medical school. It's very hard. The medical students don't hear it. So you come in with this bias and that's what you think. The next problem is both the doctors and the patients think, you're going to tell me this and I'm going to worry the rest of my life and nobody will marry me and there's nothing I can do about it, so I don't want to know. I just don't want to know. Well, in reality, the American College of Medical Genetics and Genomics have been thinking about this a lot. And they have picked out, every year they publish a new list of genes that there's something you can do about. So now there's 84 genes. And if you have Lynch syndrome for cancer, you can get lots of screening that can help save your life if you catch the cancer early. If you have my mutation, finally got on that list, FLNC, you can get echocardiograms and then you can get on medicines for cardiomyopathy, you can get a defibrillator, and you can save your life. So they're not going to put a gene on there if you just do exercise and eat right is going to save your life. You have to have a real therapy to save your life before they put that list. And they argue about it, and they have committees. We don't want to frighten people with this. So they're not going to tell you if you have Huntington's disease, because there's nothing we can do about it. They're not going to tell you if you have a mutation that causes Alzheimer's, because at the moment there's nothing we can do about it. But as there's more things we can do and as we learn more genes, they'll be on that list. So there is something you can do about it. It's like I tell people to think about it like you're getting your blood pressure checked. We don't say, I don't want to know. Of course you want to know. There's things you can do. You can eat a little different. You can you can take a blood pressure pill and it can add 10 years to your life. It doesn't mean you're going to die tomorrow. And the same thing with the mutation, with the bad mutation. Some of these mutations have a very high rate of causing a problem, and some of them have a lower rate. A mutation in the gene in my family, if the doctor looks for it, 90% of the time will find some abnormality. But only 15% of the people who have the mutation die suddenly. So it's not like you have the mutation, you're going to die tomorrow. You may never die from that. You're going to die, I guess.
Yeah, we're all going to die of something. But you know what? We always say here, knowledge is not powerful in and of itself. Applied knowledge is powerful. So just knowing is one part. And this is why we do this podcast, to put this information out so as many patients who are battling a disease, or even caregivers, if you have a certain syndrome or certain family history, those that are curious can find this information about, learn these conversations. And to bring this full circle back to your book highlights how your family turned a medical tragedy of your then 4-year-old uncle, Eugene, into a family lore. And you mentioned that the story was fabricated to protect marriage prospects of their surviving children. And I never thought about that.
I mean, I didn't get to talk with my grandma. She died when I was 2 years old. But that's what I imagine. So she was a dressmaker. My uncle was 4. My father was 2. What she claimed was that this mirror, huge dressmaker's mirror, you know how that's busy, huge, fell on the boy and killed him. And they moved. They moved from where they lived to a different town. And this story was passed down to me, my children. My cousin knew this story, and it was a tragedy that surrounded us and bothered us and saddened us. And while I was writing the book, I got the death certificate because my cousin thought my father must have been babysitting and was older. Well, it turned out my father was 2. He wasn't babysitting. And I didn't look at anything else except the date. And then later I said, I've got this death certificate. I wonder what kind of injuries he had, what killed him. And I read the cause of death. He was in the hospital for 5 days with heart failure. There was no accident. That was totally fabricated. Now, why she fabricated it, that's my surmise. I know that not just Jews, but everybody doesn't want people to, we didn't know about DNA, but they did know about bad things running in families. And they didn't want the stigma.
I talked to a lot of, people whose family members or themselves have been impacted. And I knew about this growing up that with cancer or certain diseases, my family just didn't talk about it. Right. It was that culture of silence around it that is not just my family. It was, other families. But when, I kind of read this on your website and from the book, I was like, you know what? That makes a lot of sense, giving the culture of the day, the norms of the day. And we certainly have a lot more information where we can have these conversations that are empowering conversations versus conversations that instill fear or anxiety, right? So the most difficult part about genetics, about a disease like cardiomyopathy, can be starting conversations with family in order to get screened, to get tested. And because you're not sure how people are going to process knowing just the similar conversations that you and your husband had. Many struggle to discuss inherited risk with relatives in general, no matter what the disease or the condition is. What would be your top 3 tips for initiating these conversations, especially when fear or stigma is involved?
So there were 2 sets of family that I contacted. One were people I knew, who knew Karen, who knew the whole story. That was easier. There was another set of people who I never met, who never heard of Karen, who never heard of me, but were still at risk. And I found them and I called them. One of the big mistakes I made at the beginning that I learned about and corrected was to tell the whole story first and then tell them there was something they could do about it. It's much better when you tell them right away, I have something to tell you, and there's something you can do about it to make it better. to solve it. Then they want to listen. If they're just going to hear about a genetic problem, they're turning off. They're already decided, I don't want to know. You have to tell them right away, there's a not a cure, but there's a treatment, there's things we can do. Then you want to stress that they and their children, they may never get sick, but if they get extra screening, someone may have this mutation, and it might, in one of their children or grandchildren, cause disease and kill them. And we can prevent that. We can much lower the risk of that by doing this test. And with the people who already knew about it, so my cousins who were there at the funeral and who were shocked and knew the whole thing, they were already worried. They had figured this out. They wanted to get tested so they could cross this off their list and not have to worry about it. And it turned out for them, luckily, that was the case. So it freed them from worry. So that's another thing it can do, is free family from worry. So you have to connect, remind them that there's something you can do, and then get them to do it because of their kids or grandkids. And remind them that it doesn't mean that even if they have it, it doesn't mean that it has to change their life or that it's going to cause illness. It's just that they have to do a few other tests, like getting blood pressure every year.
And we want this information, and this is why we have great guests like Susan Liebman on, who's wrote a wonderful story, shared her story with the world, to be able to reach more people like you, the viewer who's watching this, the person who's listening to this, to know how to have the language and then the confidence to have these conversations with your family members and also your care providers for the purpose of whatever has happened in the past in terms of health history. We can turn that pain into power and really empower our lives going forward. And in some cases, prevent these things from happening in future generations. Susan Liebman, research geneticist, author of The Dressmaker's Mirror, Sudden Death, Genetics, and a Jewish Family's Secret. Okay, so what are you guys reading in your book club these days, Susan?
What's the book we just read? Now I'm blanking. I'm not in that club. I'm in 3 or 4 other book clubs, though.
3 or 4 others?
Yeah.
So you are a reader. You are a reader, a voracious reader.
I am a reader, yeah. I can't click on one of those, but I am going to plug another book that's related to mine, but you might like. And it's called A Fatal Inheritance by Larry and Gracia. Do you know that book?
I do.
It's about P53. It turns out I work on P53 in yeast, so that was sort of a connection, but it's a story of a family tragedy. And it, just like my book, I describe it as a love story to my family, because a lot of it is about the family and how they responded, and a functional family, despite these problems. I think Larry and Gracia's book is similar. It's a love story to his family as well.
Well, I consider myself a reader, a voracious reader also. My last book was Prince Harry's book, Spare. I finished that on vacation, so I'm looking for a new read. So your book is in that lineup. So Susan, thank you so much for coming on our podcast and sharing your story and your book with our audience.
Thanks so much for having me. I really enjoyed chatting with you.
This is Genetics for Healthcare, a podcast for patients.